Recorded at the studios of Chicago Public Media, WBEZ, this is Stages to Success. The drive to excel is universal, as is the pride in a job well done. Whether you're staring down a decision maker for a multi-million-dollar contract, a television camera or microphone, a negotiating adversary, or an irate conductor, the pressure to perform can be exhilarating and exhausting. Join me and meet great storytellers from music and business. Today's guest from the symphony orchestra world is Frank Almond, concertmaster of the Milwaukee Symphony. We started off talking about our mutual friend from San Diego, the late Tal Perks, flutist from the San Antonio Symphony. I've known about you since I was Tal's roommate in college.
That's funny.
Yeah, because we shared a room our first year at Eastman, and he'd tell me about, sort of your, you guys had a lot of really successful musicians. Was it out of your youth symphony at San Diego? Is that how you guys all knew each other?
Yeah, it was really an odd time around there. There were a number of musicians from that area at that time that went on to actually either music school or even dared to make it a profession.
I remember Tal telling me when we were at Eastman that he had these two friends that were brothers that were really good rock musicians in addition to being classical music, and he throws out the name the Almond brothers, and I'm thinking, no, wait a minute. How does he know? Yeah, how does he know those guys? Yeah, different family. But you mentioned your brother has, and I watched those videos. He's had a really successful career as a drummer in the pop music.
We always jokingly refer to him as the famous one in the family, which he is actually.
Well, pop music blows us classical musicians out of the water for popularity.
Yeah. Fortunately, he's immensely talented. He actually worked his ass off too. I mean, it was it's been a really interesting trajectory for him.
And you played, did you play, you said you played drums too, or was it guitar?
Yeah, I did, because there was a kit laying around, in the garage, and I was really fascinated eventually when my brother practiced a lot, even as a kid, and I didn't always. But I became really interested in how those guys looked at the concept of time and rhythm and how they had to do so many different things at once. So I, started messing around just with the drum kit and got, proficient enough to just get around. And later on, it came in handy.
Were you your typical violinist? You started this thing at 4 years old before you could read and...
I did the Suzuki method, actually.
Okay.
Which was also sort of strange because it was one of the first large-scale Suzuki programs in the United States, for whatever reason, started in San Diego, California.
Wow.
And it started at the university there by a guy who had gone to Matsumoto to work with Suzuki. And he brought this thing back and decided to, start a program. Coincidentally, my father taught at the same university down the hall, and he thought, oh, this sounds kind of interesting. And so he enrolled, I think my younger brother, who's the drummer, and myself, and I think even my older brother. But I was the only one that sort of stuck with it.
Was your dad teaching music at this school, or what did he teach at the college?
He was a vocal guy who did all the choirs for the university there, and he eventually wound up doing the chorus that worked for the San Diego Symphony. And my older brother is an aeronautic engineer, and he was off working when he was 18 or something. He's super freaky talent in that area. And I stopped playing at one point. I just got sick of the whole thing, and I had a teacher I didn't really connect with, and I did that whole teen rebellion thing probably when I was 14 or 15, and stopped for about a year, I think.
You didn't play at all?
Not much, anyway. Not seriously. I was thinking of just not doing it. I also got out of high school early. I got enough credits together that I think I got out when I was I was just about to turn 16, and so I was out of high school really pretty early. And so I had stopped by that time for many months, and it was one of those weird situations where a really great teacher showed up in the area, moved there from, at the time, L.A., but he was Russian, and I think my mom finally convinced me to practice a little bit and go and play for him. And at the same time, I got into Tanglewood when I was about that age in the high school program.
So
and I spent a summer kind of working with both Victor Yampolsky and Joseph Silverstein.
So from age 14, where you basically quit, within a year, you're studying with the concertmaster of the Boston Symphony at Tanglewood.
I wouldn't say studying, but I played for him a number of times. I had a couple of people that I played for that summer, as well as chamber music with other members of the Boston Symphony.
Right.
And, maybe it was a little bit earlier. It was like 13, 14, something like that. But, yeah, it was a pretty quick turnaround. I mean, when I realized that I was getting out of high school and facing not really having that much of a college opportunity other than music, at least to start with, I got focused very quickly. And also, this guy was a really good teacher, and I could see results. I could feel it, and and I worked really hard. I mean, I was working harder than I had ever before, like suddenly practicing 4 or 5 hours a day. And
right.
Within a month or so, it was clear that this guy had a completely different way of working with the violin, and lots of rudiments and not a whole lot of music, but basically technical stuff for, I'd say, a good 6 or 7 months. That's about all I did.
Did you like the music, or did you like the excellence, Frank? I think that's what I was driving at with my earlier question.
First, I think it was more just having some focus and some structure, and a different life than I'd had when I was in high school. You know, I was getting up and working, and I had a small circle of friends who were doing, similar things as musicians. I had I had 2 brothers that were very, very driven with what they were doing, and fortunately, a couple of parents that were encouraging, but would have not. I don't think they would have cared if any of us went into music because they were musicians themselves. They just wanted us to do something that was, had some depth to it and that we wanted to do. So they weren't beating us over the heads like, the other prodigies that maybe you've heard of. When you're from Southern California and you meet some kid that's been in boarding school and done Juilliard preschool,
preschool's probably right.
Yeah. Juilliard pre-college for 8 years, and that kind of stuff. It's just, I didn't know how to react to that. I thought that was crazy, but they could play.
Yep.
They, a lot of them I became good friends with. So on top of that, I met Silverstein, who was suddenly this idea that you didn't have to just be one thing really struck me. And that was probably one of the more important things from that summer. He was a guy who, to me, had this blazing intellect. He was an incredible chamber musician. He was a great teacher, and he was a great soloist.
Yep.
And he got to play orchestra also. And I thought, wow, that's like the opposite of being burned out as a soloist. But later on, when I got to school, and there were so many people trying to be soloists, that was just the thing. You did standard repertory for 4 years, and you kind of fit in orchestra and chamber music when you could, but it was always sort of down the food chain.
Right. Which
I always thought was kind of dumb, because the odds of you being a soloist and sustaining a career, I could even see at that point, were it's even the greatest ones. It's such a precarious business where so many things have to fall into place, even if you are the most gifted person on the planet. To sustain a career as a soloist is very, very unusual. So the mix of things also, to me, was appealing because it was just more interesting.
Yeah.
I didn't feel like I wanted to play a Mendelssohn violin concerto over and over for the next 10 years. I mean, there's nothing wrong with Mendelssohn, but it's especially when I got to school and met some of these people and saw what the lifestyle was actually like, rather than this kind of glorified vision of it that you have growing up, where you're, it's a hard life being a soloist.
You aimed at Juilliard. Did you have any other backup plans, or was it, I'm going to go to Juilliard, or I don't know, maybe I won't do this anymore?
It was interesting. Or it was interesting to me looking back now that there were a couple of schools I looked at. The only one seriously was BU,
Boston University,
because of Tanglewood, really.
Yep.
And he was there, and they were very enthusiastic. But at the same time, I felt like I needed to at least try and get into Juilliard.
Right.
I actually did get into Juilliard right after Tanglewood, and then I didn't go.
You mean you waited a year, or what happened?
I got in. I did not get the teacher I wanted, which I found out later on was a clerical mistake.
Wow.
But it took me. I didn't find that out for a long time, and I thought. I also felt like I was just too young to kind of drop into that sea of delay students that were all doing the same thing that I was trying to do. Now, remember, Juilliard at that time, it was like going to work. You dropped into New York City, you got an apartment, and you went to school, and the building opened at 8 and closed at 10. And it's not like now, where they have a dorm and they have a student life and, volleyball tournaments or whatever they do. Yeah, you had to have a kind of emotional intelligence, I think, to survive, especially at that age. I mean, I was still 16. I would have been starting pretty early.
Yeah.
And I just wasn't quite sure. And I thought maybe I could just hang with this other guy for a year and give it another shot, which is what happened. And I ended up just really spending a year practicing more than I ever had in my entire life, and did a couple music competitions and got a prize in Paganini competition. And by the time I got there, I also went to Aspen for a summer before I went to Juilliard. So that kind of laid the groundwork for at least knowing some people from the city.
And were you a Dorothy DeLay student at Juilliard?
I was, but it started in Aspen.
Okay.
Because she took me in Aspen. And I think that's where I found out. That's right. Yeah, it's kind of funny. This is jarring my memory a little bit. Because once I got to Aspen, she's like, "You auditioned, and then you didn't go." She remembered my audition, and I said, "Well, I didn't get the right teacher." And then she sort of spilled the beans, and she's like, "What do you mean?"
Wow.
It turned out she had taken me, but whatever. I was working with her and spent a summer in Aspen with her and went there in the fall.
For our non-music listeners, she's like going to Yoda, right? I mean, as a violinist in that day, she was the person.
Yeah, I mean, she really sort of, was the big name. After Galamian passed away, there were some others there, but she had a record and a pedigree of students that got a lot of people's attention. She also had a huge class and a number of assistants. So there was a little bit, of a facade there about how much you were really going to be working with her. But I kind of knew that anyway. And so, yeah.
What about that virtuoso, food chain there? Where did you fit in with those violinists, and who were they?
Well, first of all, I didn't really think that way, and I didn't want to think that way unless it was so obvious that, when I was there, it was mostly, I think, a lot of younger violinists that were really starting to make their bigger careers. So Nadja was playing a lot at that time. She'd won Naumburg and was on Carson all the time, and she's a big star, and she'd show up once in a while.
Yeah, and we can't shop talk too much because I have a business listenership. This is Nadja Salerno-Sonnenberg, and She's a really good softball player. I played her with at Aspen. That's what I remember about her.
Yeah, I think she still is.
And was Jimmy Lynn there at that time?
Jimmy Lynn was around. Robert McDuffie.
Oh yeah.
And then there were these, to me, the kind of more interesting side of the business was becoming apparent with people like Midori, who sort of exploded.
Yep.
And Gil Shaham was around.
Holy cow.
I liked Gil a lot personally.
Yep.
And he and his parents and I sort of hit it off. And later on, Gil and I, we always stayed friends. Two of my closest friends were David Kim and Peter Winograd.
Mm-hmm.
And David, of course, is the concertmaster of the Philadelphia Orchestra now. And we still keep in touch.
This is an unbelievable stable. This is sort of like playing football for Alabama. I mean, you've got all-stars all over the place.
I happened to meet Eugene Drucker around this time, who's one of the violinists in the Emerson Quartet. This was like the mid-'80s. And we just kind of I met him in Aspen, and we just kind of hit it off, he and his wife and I. And we're still really close. And that gave me an insight, not just intellectually, but also from a chamber music standpoint. These guys, they were the Emerson Quartet already, and they were 10 or 12 years in, and I really saw what that life was like, and I really saw like up close and personal how this really works. Aside, as opposed to how you think it's going to work. These guys were successful, quote unquote, and as Gene once joked, he's like, yeah, we're playing all the time. I've eaten in pretty much every Denny's there is in the United States.
Now, you had sort of this multifaceted view towards the violin as a career. Now, even though you were pretty multifaceted, you still entered the Tchaikovsky competition. And that's when
the orchestra thing was not on my radar yet.
Okay.
Except that I had been concertmaster at Tanglewood when I was probably too young. So I had a little taste of what that was like, and both the pros and cons.
Uh-huh.
And then I did it at Juilliard also. At the time, it was a little bit of a different era, and there were a couple of competitions that could still, I saw them as stepping stones or as a kind of framework to move on to something else, and it was something like the Tchaikovsky competition. If you could get to a certain point, managers would take notice, which was still a part of the equation at the time. Mm-hmm. This is how different it was then. I remember getting into the finals of the Tchaikovsky competition and someone telling me that they actually saw it mentioned on CNN.
Right. Well, that's when I sort of remembered the name Frank Almond, because I heard about it in a similar context. I thought, oh my gosh, that was Tal's friend. Now, for those who don't know, you and two other people became a focus of a documentary movie. That's where I saw you again after a few years of not hearing about you. When did you realize in this competition that this filmmaker was following you around and was going to document this in a movie?
Well, we knew almost instantly that there were people around filming all the time. And there was one American crew who had done a doc on the Van Cliburn competition.
Okay.
Some of us had seen. We knew who these guys were, but I also learned then that we don't really know what's going to happen with the footage.
Yep.
They're just around like filming everything, right? So we'd be over here, and we just got used to talking to them, and later on they crafted a film together because they don't know what's going to happen either. Half of the people that everybody thought was going to do really super great, and these are the medal winners. they're out in the second round, or some of them were out in the first round for whatever reason.
Well, it's like covering the Olympics. People just can have a bad day.
A little bit, except it's difficult to convey nowadays the Cold War aspect of being in Moscow in 1986.
Right.
And that was a really big part of the equation for that competition. I hate to say that, but it really was. And that was also interesting to me as kind of a history buff. I didn't exactly know what was going on, but I had some idea of what was happening. And, we were kids, really. I mean, I was 21, 22 there. And then you're like dropping into seriously communist Moscow. This was before anything had, even... I think anybody was even thinking about anything changing there. I remember it was being very, very rigid, and we were on a tight leash. We were, even though it was sponsored by the government, and that opened a lot of doors for us. I distinctly remember playing Frisbee in Red Square.
Yeah,
trying to play Frisbee. I just thought it would be amazing to go out and toss a Frisbee a couple times in Red Square and see what would happen.
And what happened?
A guy with a large gun came over and waved, his finger at us. And we showed him our Tchaikovsky passes, and he didn't speak English at all. But it was clear that we could not play Frisbee in Red Square.
That's great.
This was not going to happen.
And to give you a chance to plug it so people can watch, what was the name of the documentary and who was the filmmaker?
I think it was the 8th Tchaikovsky competition. It's from 1986. Somebody posted it on YouTube at one point. I don't know if it's still up. I want to say Bill Furtick, Fertik. And this is another interesting thing that I think sticks with me now and was definitely a factor. We were there for a long time. It went almost a month.
Oh, my.
At the time. And, I mean, if you got to the finals. If you didn't get to the finals, they put you on a plane like next morning. There was very little food. We were in a culture that we totally did not understand, or most of us didn't. My friends were leaving like every day if they were eliminated. And it got down to like maybe 8 or 9 of us that were just kind of around. And so there was this kind of bond that developed, I think, as time went on. But at the same time, there was an incredible amount of pressure, and we were tired, and you couldn't – I mean, I joke about it, but we couldn't really find any real food. I mean, it was there, but it was weird, and it was just – you were immersed in this communist society, and you had to kind of fight your way through it. And we were tired at the end, and that's when the finals were. And I think there were some highlights for me in the finals, but I can't say it was like the greatest thing I've ever done. But at the same time, you do what you can, and you're playing. I played Brahms concerto and then Tchaikovsky concerto. You play them back to back.
Wow. That
was the requirement at the time. I don't know if it is now. So I did what I could do, and whatever. They come up with whatever hierarchy they come up with. But I'd say, aside from whatever prize I was officially awarded, the film was really what gave most people an exposure within the business, because it was, despite our involvement, it was a really good film.
It was. It was nerve-wracking.
It was nerve-wracking, but it had an arc to it, and it had some real characters in it. And I thought it was much better, really, really well-crafted film when you compare it to a lot of other music documentaries.
Right.
And a couple of great lines from Bill Wolfram.
Or those horrible movies about competitions. I still remember that Richard Dreyfuss and Amy Irving won about a piano competition that
Right, called The Competition.
Right, that would sort of presuppose that a musician on stage wasn't trying to be poised, couldn't fight their own nerves. I mean, you watch these people practically have a nervous breakdown on stage and think, well, they're not performers.
Right.
So when you came back from Moscow, did you still have some time to finish at Juilliard?
It was between my senior year and my first year of master's.
And you did your master's at Juilliard too.
I did my master's at Juilliard.
So
yeah, I remember playing the Brahms Concerto at Juilliard as the competition winner in June, and leaving 3 weeks later for Moscow.
And when you came back, is it like, hey, see, the conquering hero comes, or was it just like, oh yeah, somebody else went to the Tchaikovsky and did pretty well?
I'd say it was more the latter.
That shows you the rarefied air you lived in, dude.
Like down the street, Gil Shaham would be like, oh yeah, I'm playing with Berlin next week, and there's always somebody else who's doing stuff, and that's great. That's one of the really, driving, interesting things about any high-end school at that time,
right?
Or even now, it's like, you go to Harvard Business School, and that's what happens, or you go to Eton or Oxford, and there's always somebody else thinking differently and kind of off the charts.
Right.
That doesn't mean that they're ultimately going to be happier or quote unquote better than you or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But at the time, for me, it was a motivator.
Sure.
And the film also didn't come out until October.
Oh.
And I think after that, there was more recognition of what some of us were doing or had done the previous summer.
So
I remember telling some woman I was interested in that I'd gone to the Tchaikovsky competition that previous summer.
Yeah.
And she completely blew me off, but then saw the film. And suddenly I got a date.
Awesome, Frank.
Yeah.
So
I was like, wait.
Yeah.
Come on. Really?
I hope she was a music student.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So she wasn't just a waitress from the diner. It said, "Oh, I saw you in a movie. That's cool."
Yeah.
When did you train your sights on the first chair of a violin section to be a concertmaster? At what point did you start aiming there?
It was actually when I was out of school, and I don't think I really consciously aimed for it. What happened was I was freelancing a little bit in New York. I was lucky that I didn't have to do a whole lot of that. I had a couple of teaching positions and enough solo and chamber music stuff to make ends meet.
Yep.
But it wasn't really what I wanted to do.
Did you end up sitting in a section first at some orchestra?
No, actually, the entire front stand of the New York City Ballet Orchestra opened up, which sounds crazy to go for, but to me, I was encouraged to do it, first of all, by some of my colleagues who I knew there. Secondly, I knew that Balanchine had tons of solo violin stuff.
Yep.
And third, it just sounded kind of interesting. I had never really worked with dancers before, and I had done some one-off things with people like David Parsons and some other modernists. And it was a salary. It was a salary that had things like benefits, like you could get health care.
Yep.
And at that point, I was like, So I went out for it, and I think, yes, I officially won the assistant job, and Guillermo Figueroa won the concertmaster job, but Guillermo couldn't start right away. So I played a lot of concertmaster stuff there, a lot of it. And it was really, really eye-opening and educational. I probably didn't have any idea what I was doing at the time, but for me it was great. It was a great stepping stone. And then another opportunity presented itself in Texas, actually, in Fort Worth, of all places, and went and did that. And I played concertmaster there for 3 seasons, which I liked a lot because it allowed me to do other things as well. Also, at the time, they had a 2-tiered contract where it was chamber orchestra and the big orchestra.
Yeah.
I was playing all kinds of different repertory with larger and smaller groups. And I was able to go back and forth to New York all the time. I was still doing some solo work, and there was a concertmaster opening in Milwaukee. And I had been trying to find a way to play for the music director at the time, Dennick McCall. I'd tried to find a way to audition for him, mostly as a soloist.
Yep.
And I thought, well, if I take this audition and I get in the finals, maybe he'll hear me. At least he'll be there. So that's kind of how it worked. I remember playing the Tchaikovsky concerto with the Fort Worth Symphony in the afternoon on a Sunday. And I flew to Milwaukee that night, and the audition was the next day. And they did it all in one day. I also remember that.
Unbelievable.
Which almost killed me.
Yeah.
But, I wound up standing up there playing for McCall and the committee.
Yeah.
And he hired me as concertmaster.
And for people who aren't part of our industry at all, they see a concertmaster, if they've gone to a classical concert, come out, take that bow at the beginning. Talk a little bit about what that chair, being the boss of that section, the bowing responsibility, talking to other principals. Just explain the nuts and bolts of the job to the average person who would have no idea what the concertmaster does.
Yeah, I think the best analogy might be maybe a sports analogy, where there are various different kinds of coaches for different sections of a baseball team.
Yep.
Right? And theoretically, an orchestra has principals in every section that are kind of tuned into each other or paying attention to each other. Just like there's a batting coach, there's a pitching coach, there's a guy standing at the end of first base kind of helping along, right? But they're not necessarily playing. We are playing.
Yep.
And you're part of a team, but at the same time in rehearsals, there's no way that a conductor can, get every single person's opinion about everything, especially in a short rehearsal period. So I think in an ideal world, the 4-string principals, 5, bass is usually tuned into the cello principal. You're all sort of working as this kind of giant chamber music group, and hopefully there's a uniformity that kind of emanates from the front stands back.
And, for our business listeners, they don't even really realize what bowings are. But in the violin section, which is going to be, in some orchestras as much as 18 people in the firsts and 17 in the seconds, explain why everybody's bow needs to move the same direction. It seems so basic to those of us who know it, but not to somebody from outside.
And it looks so cool.
Yeah, right.
But really what it is your right arm becomes kind of your mouthpiece.
Mm-hmm.
You're not making any sound with your left hand. So as an orchestral musician, you have to be able to work out bowings that make sense for the musical content and the section that you're working with to get a particular phrase across, or just so the whole thing lays well technically and makes sense.
Something
right?
I never even thought about, Frank. I mean, you're a finalist
for wind players. It's like how you breathe.
Right.
You have 20 people that had to breathe the same way to make the same sound.
Right. But what just dawned on me is, having played for decades in orchestras, it never dawned on me that Frank Almond, who made the finals of the Tchaikovsky, might have to make his bowings or some of the technique simpler for players who aren't as technically advanced, though they're fantastic players in a violin section. Does that ever happen?
Or it's not necessarily that. It's not necessarily a matter of expertise, because believe me, there are people in my section who can play technically way better than I can.
Interesting.
But what I think I can bring to the table is a basic knowledge of what will work in terms of bowings for our section and a particular conductor.
Yep.
and what I think they're going to be after. Certainly the music director, once you get to know them, you get to know like kind of their concepts and philosophies. But if it's a guest conductor, you kind of, and they happen to be doing a Beethoven symphony where you can do it 800,000 different ways, or especially like a Mozart symphony or something earlier. Mm-hmm. It's more ambiguous. It's kind of a crapshoot, and I'll put stuff in there, and you hope that that's kind of what they want. But we've still gotten to certain rehearsals where we end up changing a lot of stuff, which is time consuming and basically burns up time and money, when you're changing bowings. It does. So the idea is to get something fairly uniform that everybody can relate to and feels like makes sense. And in the first rehearsal, so you're not just erasing or changing things unless it's something really, singular that a particular conductor wants to impose.
Stages to Success can be found on TuneIn Radio, Google Play, iTunes, or our RSS feed. The link can be found at www.stagestosuccesspodcast.com. Try telling your Amazon Echo, Alexa, to play it by commanding, Alexa, play Stages to Success podcast. We're listening to an interview with Frank Almond, concertmaster of the Milwaukee Symphony. I want to make the turn in the last part of our interview towards your instrument. The concertmaster of the Milwaukee Symphony playing a Stradivarius it's like a Lamborghini, right? Being driven by the richest kid at your high school. I mean, it's
except for the last part of it.
It's just unbelievable. How did you particularly get the foundation behind you, or the people behind you that got this instrument into your hands?
Yeah, that's a really interesting chapter of my time here. I mean, I'll give you the short version for your listeners.
Yep.
Of how this thing showed up. Literally in 2008, I got an email totally out of the blue. And the subject line was a violin. And it was essentially the owners of a Stradivarius violin. They went on to describe it, that it was part of an estate situation, and they were looking for guidance on really what to do with it.
Amazing.
Now, I get emails like this, or even letters, once in a while. I found my Strad in this garage sale. I know it's a Strad because it says Antonio Stradivari, 1874.
1874.
Okay. And I have to tell them that Stradivari died in 1737, so it's probably not a Strad. But this email had some really intriguing things in it and some detail in it that was, it was clearly worth investigating. And it kind of went from there. I got in touch with them right away. This particular violin had not been seen in a long time. I didn't know that much about what they were talking about in the email until I met with them, and it was clear that they were in fact in possession of this instrument. There's a weird Brahms connection with this violin too. Kind of interesting.
How's that?
Well, it was owned. I don't know how much of that site you poked around, the Violin's Life site, but the Röntgen family owned this instrument for decades after Lipinski died.
Okay.
And Engelbert Röntgen wound up being concertmaster of the Gewandhaus. And so whenever Brahms premiered something at the Gewandhaus from a certain period of time, I did the math and actually got in touch with the Gewandhaus a couple of times. And this guy was playing this violin as the concertmaster.
Yeah, and for our non-music listeners, the Gewandhaus is Leipzig's orchestra that's,
Exactly, yeah.
Mendelssohn conducted, I think.
Right.
Had it been purchased as an investment? You had mentioned it spent some time in Leipzig. Was it an investment in a vault?
by the current owners in 1963 for something like $17,000.
Wow. Well, that was a really nice
Yeah.
investment. Did it get played in between, or was it locked away?
Yeah, it did. It was played by a member of their extended family, and it's kind of a fascinating story with a great ending. I think that it wound up here. There were a lot of very peripheral and interesting connections to the city of Milwaukee, which is why it wound up back here, and why they contacted me, I think, in the end.
And you said that there's an actual website for this. I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, I was going to say, for your listeners who want to really kind of get down in the weeds with this stuff, it's called violinslife.org. It's a project I started about 5-6 years ago because it was so amazing to have this thing. And there was a lot of information about the pedigree and history of this instrument. And ultimately, after months and months of us discussing what they wanted to do with the violin, with us saying, this is what happens when you sell it, this is what happens when you keep it, this is what happens if you loan it out. There's all kinds of pros and cons to all those different things.
Sure.
But it's a functional antiquity that's very, very valuable.
And it's pedigreed. It's pedigreed beyond belief and charted beyond belief. I've heard those kind of stories before. How did you insure it?
Well, like a lot of specialized areas, there are divisions of Lloyd's that just do musical instruments. So it's ironic that the risk factor on these instruments, or this echelon of instruments, is considered extremely low, and actually it is extremely low. So the insurance on a seven-figure instrument, something like this, is actually probably less than most of your listeners would guess. The really great ones, they can. I saw that one. Somebody tried to sell some Strad Viola a couple of years ago for like $50 million, and this is nothing like that. But it's not chump change.
When you played this instrument for the first time, was it like the movies? This is everything I ever thought a violin could be. Oh my gosh, I need to play this for every chance I get.
No, actually, it wasn't. It was more like, this is obviously an unbelievable instrument that's clearly a golden period Strad that has not been played for about 20 years and needs a little bit of attention.
Has it changed because you've played it regularly?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I felt immediately that weird kind of Strad potential, and I've had some pretty good luck with just playing great instruments over the years, and you could just feel it like right away.
Right.
It was you mentioned Lamborghini. It was like a Lamborghini that had needed a bunch of work done on its engine or something.
I have a 1963 Falcon, so I can sort of.
Oh, there you go.
I can sort of identify. It took some doing. All right, now
which is what they did, and then from there it was like back and forth and back and forth. And finally they were like, why don't you look after it? Why don't you play it? Because it'll be connected with the community. And
unbelievable.
People can go and see it every week, and that would make us, really happy. That's the goal. Because they didn't want to sell it. I think my answer to that was I thought that was a really good idea. I thought it was a really good strategy going forward.
Okay, so for my listeners that don't know the rest of the story, I get to do the big reveal here. This instrument got stolen right out of your hands. It made international news. Tell the story as best you can. I want to hear from the horse's mouth, you know. And I had my own super spy theory because I'd heard of Frank Almond for 30 years.
Yeah, which I want to hear, actually.
Yeah, I'll tell you my super spy theory before. Frank conspired with some insurance person in a really awesome scheme to have this thing disappear, because there's no way some bum off the streets in Milwaukee knows to steal a Strad, and they're splitting the proceeds, and he's got money in a Cayman's bank account. That's what I told Karen. That's what I want it to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
but it makes perfect sense, right?
But tell me the real story. How did this?
Just to comment on that, I actually, in the 2 days after the violin was stolen, I got trolled pretty hard on Facebook and a couple other places by people who really did believe that.
Oh, well, there you go. See?
Yeah, and actually one of them was somebody that I kind of knew from New York, and I was amazed that she was putting that out there because it was so outrageous.
Well, all you have to do is watch 24, and you know it's true. But,
or Mozart in the Jungle, which actually stole our idea.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, they actually did an episode based on a stolen violin that was it had such close parallels that clearly I knew where they got the idea from.
Okay, so
that was one of maybe no episodes I ever watched.
So for my commercial real estate listeners who know nothing about music, but now are fascinated with the idea of a 7-figure thing being stolen from a person on the street in Milwaukee, give them the John Le Carre version of what happened that night.
Okay, so I run a chamber music series here in Milwaukee, and basically what happened was after a concert I was walking out the stage door to my car, which was parked maybe 15 feet from the stage door, and I was really happy because it was about 7 degrees below zero that night, which even for Milwaukee is very, very cold. And there was this van backed in next to my car, and it was running, and I thought it was weird, but we'd had a reception that went late, whatever, and you're kind of like, it was a really intense concert, and I'm kind of in my own world. But, there were people around. We walked out with 5 or 6 people. And I went to put the violin in the car, and this guy walked around the front of the van and got closer and closer. And it was dark, and I couldn't really tell what was going on, except that at the last second, he opened up his jacket, and which was this giant fur jacket with a fur helmet and everything because it was really cold. And there was these little flashing red lights, and I thought, why is that guy taking my picture? And it was a taser.
Oh, my gosh. I didn't know this part.
Yeah, he shot me with a taser.
Awesome, Frank.
Really? Yeah, but clearly you have not been shot with a taser.
No, but I mean, it's a great story. I didn't know it was going to get John Le Carre this good.
Yeah, I got shot with a taser, and that's not a great feeling. If you talk to any of your law enforcement friends, they will inform you of what it feels like to get shot with a taser. But I went down very quickly and up very quickly in time to see this crazy van driving around the corner, and the violin was gone. So I knew immediately what had happened.
Sure.
Because it wasn't like somebody stealing the violin had never occurred to me. What was mystifying to me was the way this had all happened, because, I mean, I knew a lot about instruments that had either been stolen or disappeared, or practically any instrument that had disappeared. I knew at least something about the circumstances. This is not how it happens. It's just not. I also knew how I would have stolen it, and it was it was the opposite. So you've got this kind of Scooby-Doo van. This is not a quality vehicle. You've got a taser.
Yeah.
I've met maybe 2 or 3 policemen that have ever heard of an armed robbery using a taser. That just doesn't happen. And all of the detail with it, like, clearly this had been planned and targeted.
Of course.
Which also was really unusual. Like, that's not how high-end instruments get stolen or disappear. They're almost always accidentally stolen. Somebody's sitting in a coffee shop, right, on their phone, looking the other way. Somebody walks away with the instrument, then they have a big problem because everybody's looking for the instrument instantly, right? Or you leave it in the back of a cab and somebody takes it and they think they're going to pawn it or whatever. The problem is it's easy to steal them. You can't do anything with them.
Well, especially not a Stradivarius. Do you think?
Yeah,
well,
they're completely worthless as soon as you steal them.
Now, you At the time, did you think they knew this was a Stradivarius? They'd been following a story in the paper, or what ran through your mind?
I didn't know. I mean, first of all, it was pretty shaken up, and I couldn't get my head around what had happened really for probably several hours until this kind of comical thing unfolded with me explaining to the police what had happened. And what really changed the game was that it turned out that the chief of police of Milwaukee at the time, he just retired, or not retired, but he just left as chief, was a huge symphony fan.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'd met this guy. I'd been out for like a beer with this guy.
Yep.
And somehow that night we got in touch with him, and he instantly got it. And he understood the magnitude of what was happening.
Now, because Karen and we saw the story, and within a day, it was everywhere. And the first thing I said was, can these bozos that stole this instrument have made a worse theft because of how serious it is, because of the value of this instrument and the focus? Did they have any notion, now that time has passed, did they know what they had stolen?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
It turned out that this had been planned. I mean, I didn't find out a lot about what was, how this had actually been put together until months later, actually. Some of it even a year later. This had been planned for between 3 and 4 years, as far as I can tell.
Amazing. Well, then how come they didn't do a better job and get it to like some super agent in Japan?
I know. It's like that's it for 3 years. But they were really. There was one guy who sort of oversaw the whole thing.
Yeah.
And his friend who bought him the taser. They were very good at stealing something, but forgot about the second part of stealing something, which is you have to do something with it. And that's where there's no market. That's where they got, in trouble because you can't do anything with them. And then this ton of bricks that was coming down on them literally within 12 hours, largely due to the police chief who threw every single thing that he had at them. Mm-hmm. I mean, he pulled out all the stops and every resource he could possibly think of, including something like 35 homicide detectives, like the best of the best on this case. And it didn't take them long to put together that this was not some conspiracy with the instrument being whisked off to some Dubai or whatever.
Right.
And it was probably a couple of knuckleheads who didn't know what to do after they actually had the instrument.
And how long were they on the lam with the Stradivarius?
There was an arrest made within, I think, 5 or 6 days.
Okay.
And then there were a couple of days of negotiations just for a plea bargain. And then the main perpetrator led them to the instrument. And the part of the plea bargain was that the instrument needed to be returned in good condition, quote unquote, which was really what I personally was most worried about, and what everybody else was not kindling, and we didn't want it damaged.
Right. And were they liable for more of a crime because of the value of this thing? Does it go to grand larceny, huge penalty because they stole a Strad instead of a school instrument?
Not really, because it was already the guy had 2 felony convictions.
Okay.
So when you threw in an armed robbery on top of it, he was already facing, I think, between 60 and 70 years, something like that.
Oh, my.
So that was a motivating factor, shall we say, for him to plea it down. And as much as I hated that he was not sentenced to what I thought he should be sentenced, and there was an element of violence and trauma to it, it's the best we could do with our system, and they found it, and we had people who really believed that this was serious. And it's weird in this community. It became almost a matter of like civic pride.
Well, sure.
That's incredible. To have a police chief that really he took a big risk because he didn't know, but he saw how important it was. Also because back to the way the thing showed up, there was a kind of altruism with the owners wanting this thing to be part of the community and for people to hear it. There's my personal, involvement in it. But people really rallied behind that idea. And when it was found, 9 days later, it was because of really a group effort beyond law enforcement. There were some tips that came in. There were some people from his neighborhood who, knew what was going on. It didn't hurt us that he had a habit and continues to have a habit of talking a lot. He has this notion that he is a really super high-end art thief, and he pulled this off.
Yeah,
which he did. But in the end, he would have been better off taking my wallet.
And was it like the TV shows? Did the Lloyd's of London insurance inspector, come in on the case? Did you get a lot of calls from whoever's insuring this violin?
In the 3 or 4 days after the violin was stolen, I probably did 50 things that I never thought I would ever do in my life.
Like?
None of them good. Polygraph tests.
Uh-huh.
A 7-hour interview with a couple of homicide detectives.
Uh-huh.
Who were very, very nice and very professional and eliminating suspects. Part of that was that the FBI got involved. There were all kinds of crazy things that happened.
Yeah.
And the idea that this thing was going to turn up somehow just didn't occur to me. None of us knew what to make of it.
Right.
So.
What about your insurance company? Were they all over you?
Sorry. To circle back to I lost my train of thought. Part of those 5 days were spent meeting with insurance officials. And since they're never stolen and they're never targeted, they were very perplexed, as was I.
Yep.
But I have to say, they were totally on board, and they believed what had happened. And I think they understood that this was not an inside job. Certainly.
Right.
And but yeah, I did do a couple of interviews with them.
So except for your New York colleague, nobody said, "Oh, Frank, we know you did this," or you didn't get any serious.
I'm sure there were people that thought that somehow, initially maybe the owners had something to do with it, but it was so preposterous. It's so dumb.
Right.
Why? Why? What's the motive? The insurance company's going to give us money, and they're not going to find. We'd have the same problem.
Right. You couldn't sell it. Right.
The instrument's going to turn up somewhere, and it just didn't make any sense. None of it.
Yeah.
In fact, one of the big questions out there, which I'd actually like to ask this guy one day if I ever meet him again, is what did he exactly think he was going to do with it? Were they really thinking of insurance money? Maybe. I don't know. But it was something that flummoxed both the art crimes FBI guys and the local MPD, Milwaukee Police Department guys, as well as our chief of police. Nobody understood, what they really thought they were going to do with this.
I would think it'd be some mastermind that wanted to have it in his vault who lived. I like Dubai.
Well, that's another theory that is a myth, okay? I mean, there's nobody in the world, or actually I should say, there's no evidence at all of some guy sitting somewhere with a pet cat, directing somebody to steal certain musical instruments.
Right.
There's never been anything like that. Art crime is a little bit different, where clearly there have been paintings that have been targeted and are used for other barter for other nefarious criminal activities. That exists. You can think about the Gardner paintings, for example. There's a big theory behind that. But there's no evidence that that's ever happened with any kind of musical instrument.
So, Frank, I want to know if you've ever sat back and thought, this should be on Malcolm Gladwell's podcast about psychology. Did it ever cross your mind that the fact that this Stradivarius violin got stolen from you made you one of the most famous concertmasters in the world for a period of time?
No, that hasn't occurred to me.
Well, now it has.
Well, just a couple of thoughts here.
Okay.
There are a lot of silver linings to this story that I would have never imagined.
Okay.
I'm the first to admit that. At the same time, there's a film coming, which is a feature documentary, which I think is going to be really good. And I've been able to tell this story as accurately as I can and as positively as I can, despite all the crazy stuff that happened.
Frank, I had no idea. So I got a scoop with my podcast about you being in another documentary and this about the stolen Strad.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. You made my day.
It's not out yet. Okay?
Well, okay.
Like they're finishing it up, but they've been working on it since basically the day after it happened.
Phenomenal. Yeah. Okay, keep going.
Yeah. I think the awareness raised not just in the musical community, but certainly in the local community, and just the attention that the thing got, this whole crazy story. About what these things are, how valuable they are beyond the market value, like what they mean beyond just like, they're different than paintings. They're functional. They're singular. You can't replace them. There's a finite amount of them. And just the human side of it also. Mm-hmm. I think that's what resonated with a lot of people. For a while, it was like, I felt like people were coming to the concerts, to kind of like see this Stradivarius that had gotten stolen. And that's definitely true, Mm-hmm. Certainly didn't hurt audience capacity. But it's only recently that I've started to meet people who did not know anything about this stuff. I'd say in the last 4 or 5 months, even people within musical circles, that they might have a vague recollection of it, but it's interesting when you talk to them, they're like, "Wow, like that really happened," and then they'll look up whatever article, and it there's no escaping it. I've accepted that it's just a part of the history of the instrument. It's going to be a part of my career, and if people want to come and hear me talk about it, or more importantly, hear it played, to me that's great. Whatever. I can only look at it in positive terms like that.
Yeah, and it, as you mentioned, you become part of the pedigree and part of the story.
Yeah, there's a phrase that I used to use when I started that Violins Life project, and it became much more relevant after this whole thing. That you've got this thing, this amazing tool, really super high-end tool of the trade, right? Which is what it is, and that maximizes what you can do artistically, but also really illuminates kind of your deficiencies sometimes. Mm-hmm. And every day I get up and I work with it, and you think, oh, you've got this thing to play on, and you've got this thing, and then it disappears. Yeah. And then you realize that this thing has been around for 300 and whatever years, and you think it's going through your life, and it's the opposite. Yeah,
and your life, and your life, and who you are is changed in a sense of a career. And this just came to my mind. If you had lived in 1864, you would have known the name John Wilkes Booth because he was one of the most famous Shakespearean actors of his day.
Right. And what's really happening here is that thing's going to be around a long time after I am, and I'm just passing through its life.
Yeah, that's really
It's
cool.
the opposite of what your instinct is.
That's really cool, Frank. I think Malcolm Gladwell's going to be calling you next.
No, he won't. But I did do a Moth episode, which I'm going to repeat at some point, and it's a great story on so many levels, but hard to distill down.
Frank, I really appreciate your time. You've been really generous on short notice, and I'm glad that I heard about you those 37 years ago and followed your career.
Well, thanks. Two things just in closing. Thanks for having me on your podcast. I poked around your podcast a little bit and find it fascinating. I think it's great that you're mixing up all those different kinds of experiences and people.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, I think what you did at Eastman, even though it took me forever to finally come through, for Tal, it meant a lot to me.
Thanks.
Personally.
It's a super legacy for him, for a person who really, really deeply impacted my life. I like the way Joseph Silverstein did for you. I figured out what the job was about by meeting Tal.
Yeah.
But this is the work it takes, not just being a kid musician.
Good. Well, I appreciate you spearheading that and for staying persistent with me.
You bet. Frank, thanks so much for today. I appreciate it. All right.
Good. Stay in touch.
Right. Well,
Thank
bye.
you. Bye.
I hope you enjoyed today's interview with Frank Almond, concertmaster of the Milwaukee Symphony. I'm your host, John Hunter. Digital editing and technical assistance from Monty Scott, and recorded at the studios of Chicago Public Media at Navy Pier. Join us again for people and stories from the worlds of the symphony orchestra and commercial real estate for our next episode of Stages to Success.